This is lecture number 8, the book of Zechariah, the Post-Exilic prophets. We'll be looking at slides 65 through 75. So if you could locate slide 65, we will begin there. And we will be covering the last 4 of the 8 night visions of Zechariah. You'll remember that back in chapter 1 of Zechariah, Zechariah began with 8 night visions, and we have gone through the first 4 of those, and now we come to the beginning of chapter 4. This part of Zechariah will extend from the first verse of chapter 4 through the 8th verse of chapter 6. Chapter 4 begins by describing an angel talking with Zechariah. He wakens him as a man is awakened from sleep and says, "What do you see?" He answered, "I see a solid gold lampstand with a bowl at the top and 7 lights on it, with 7 channels to the lights. Also, there are 2 olive trees by it, one on the right of the bowl and the other on its left." We don't know exactly what the lampstand in the period we're talking about look like, and whether, of course, at this point the temple has not been reconstructed. They're just in the process of reconstructing the second temple, so we don't know whether they may have brought the lampstand from Babylon, if it had been in fact taken from Solomon's original temple to Babylon and then brought back again to Jerusalem from Babylon, or whether a new lampstand is envisioned here. The only visual description we have of the lampstands that were in the temple is much later than this, in the period of Jesus in the 1st century. But we do actually have a visual depiction of that because when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70, the Roman soldiers took with them many of the pillaged items out of the temple, and one of those was the golden menorah. In this slide, to the bottom left, you see the Arch of Titus. And if you would stand inside the arch, you would be able to see on the inside wall of the arch the depiction that is shown on the right-hand slide. This interior detail of the Arch of Titus shows a menorah or a lampstand from the temple, which is very much like what is described here in Zechariah chapter 4. You'll notice it has 7 lights or 7 lamps, and each of those have a channel that goes to a central area from which the oil is drawn up through the channels to the lights. So while there's some debate about that among scholars, exactly what the lampstand may have looked like in the time of Zechariah, at least we know what it looked like about 4 centuries later. Now, before going further in this chapter, I need to talk a little bit about the structure of chapter 4. So go to slide 66, and we will talk a little bit about some of the complexities of this chapter. One of the things that is immediately apparent is that after you read the first 3 verses, in which there is described this golden lampstand and the 2 olive trees, and then the question is asked, what are these? Then before the answer is given, there is inserted into chapter 4 an oracle directly to Zerubbabel via Zechariah. And it's not until you get down to verse 11 when Zechariah says, "What are these 2 olive trees on the right and the left of the lampstand?" which is the same question basically that was asked earlier, that the answer is given, and eventually the answer is that the 2 olive branches are representative of the 2 anointed to serve the Lord, which basically is a reference to Joshua and to Zerubbabel. Because the answer to this question is postponed until the end of chapter 4, and there is this intervening oracle, some English translations of the Bible have decided that there must have been a dislocation in the text. Now, in all honesty, we don't have any Hebrew texts that show such a dislocation. This idea of a dislocation is made solely on the basis of just the fact that the answer to the question, who are these, is given later in the chapter. But if you should be reading, for instance, the New English Bible, which is the English translation that comes out of Cambridge University, it will rearrange the verses of this chapter as well as some verses back in chapter 3. And so in this first block on the left, you can see how they have rearranged the verses into what they think is a more readable format. The New American Bible, which is a Roman Catholic translation, has done somewhat the same thing, although to a lesser degree. They've not intruded into chapter 3, but they have rearranged the verses in chapter 4. And then finally, the Jerusalem Bible has done a considerable amount of rearranging, as you can see from this third block, some of it going all the way back to chapter 3 and some of it in chapter 4 as well. Most other English translations of the Bible do not rearrange the verse order of chapter 4. And I'm inclined to agree with those translators who leave the order of chapter 4 just as it appears in the Hebrew text. And the reason I do that is because there does seem to be a good argument for a chiastic structure in Zechariah 4. And if there is a chiastic structure, by rearranging the verses, you essentially destroy that structure. The structure can only stand up if the verses are left in the order in which they appear originally in the Hebrew text. So we are going to follow the order of the verses as they appear in the Hebrew text and as they appear in most English translations of the Bible. You may remember from our last lecture we briefly discussed the use of chiastic structure as a Hebrew literary device to emphasize particularly the middle of the structure. So if you'll go to the next slide, slide 67, we'll look at how this is done in chapter 4. The first 3 verses of chapter 4 then, which is the beginning of the structure, parallel the end of chapter 4, which is the last verses 11, 12, 13, and 14. Both of these have the vision of the lampstand at the beginning and then the explanation of the lampstand and the olive trees at the end. If this is a chiastic structure, then this explains why the vision of the lampstand and olive trees are separated from the explanation of the lampstand and the olive trees. They form, as it were, brackets around the interior of the structure. And so then everything else in the structure continues to move toward the middle. The B sections at the beginning, the reference that the task to rebuild the temple is going to be accomplished through the power of the Spirit, parallels the vision near the end of the structure that the 7 eyes of the Lord range the earth to accomplish God's purpose. So both of those are about the Spirit, about the work of the Spirit in giving the resources that are necessary to complete this task. Then the C sections of the chiastic structure. The first one has to do with the mountain of opposition that seems to be opposing Zerubbabel. But in spite of that opposition, through the power of the Spirit, Zerubbabel will successfully complete this temple, and when the capstone would be put into place, people would shout for joy. And then the parallel part in verse 10 is that, once again, when people saw in the hand of Zerubbabel the plumb line for construction, they would rejoice. So both of these are linked together by the rejoicing of people over Zerubbabel's leadership in rebuilding the temple. That leaves us with the very center of this chiastic structure. And the very center is in verses 8 and 9. Then the word of Yahweh came to me, the hands of Zerubbabel have laid the foundation of this temple. His hands also will complete it. And then you will know that Yahweh Sabaoth has sent me to you. This center of the chiastic structure then underscores the fact that Zerubbabel, who began as the leader in laying the foundation 16 years earlier actually, is now going to be the one who's going to complete this work, and the temple will be completed under his leadership. It seems to me that the chiastic structural approach to chapter 4 is a valid observation, and therefore the verses in chapter 4 should be left in the order in which they are found in most English Bibles and in the Hebrew text. And it does also underscore the fact that Zerubbabel is a central figure in the construction of the Second Temple. Slide 68. Now let's talk for a little bit about the meaning of this vision of the lampstand and the olive trees, which appears at both the beginning and the end of chapter 4. As we mentioned, the question about the meaning of the vision isn't answered until the end due to the chiastic structure. But there are several elements in here that merit some special attention. In the first place, you'll notice that the lamp has 7 lights. And this seems to be linked back to chapter 3, in which there is a stone with 7 eyes. The 7 the 7 lights in the lamp represent the 7 eyes of the Lord, which in turn are symbols of his divine omniscience. The number 7, somewhat similar to the number 4, is often not a mathematical number, but rather a number that symbolizes certain things. And the number 7 often symbolizes completion or fullness. In fact, you'll find a reference to the 7 eyes of the Lord all the way at the end of the New Testament in the early part of the Revelation of John. So the 7 eyes of the Lord are ways of saying that God's complete knowledge, his complete vision of everything is perfect in every way. He is divinely aware of all things, both past, present, and future. And the 7 eyes of the Lord range through the earth, and they see everything that is to be seen. Then the 2 olive trees, which are described as supplying oil for the lamps through 2 pipes, symbolize the 2 primary leaders, Zerubbabel and Joshua. And these, of course, are the same primary leaders that are described in the book of Ezra. Just a brief note about the word pipes, as it is translated in a number of English translations. We don't actually know what this word is in Hebrew. This is what scholars call a hapax legomenon, which is a Greek expression that means this word only appears one time. So this passage is the only place where this word appears in the Hebrew Bible. The problem with words that only appear one time in the Hebrew Bible is that we don't have anything to compare them with. We don't have any other verses in the Bible, and we don't have any other external manuscripts outside the Bible with this word. And so we are left to give an educated guess as to what this word may mean. Now, sometimes we may be helped by the Septuagint translation, which will tell us at least what they thought it meant in about 200 BC. In any case, most translations understand this reference to be some kind of conduit that brings the holy oil from the 2 olive trees into the lamp. And these, in turn, symbolize the primary leaders of Joshua, the high priest, and Zerubbabel, the governor. It's interesting to note especially the pedigree of both of these leaders. Zerubbabel was from the line of David, the royal family, and he was the grandson of Jehoiakim, the exiled king who was taken from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar and sent to Babylon. So in this special way, Zerubbabel carries within him the line of the royal family. And in fact, this is why Zerubbabel is going to appear in the genealogy of Jesus in the first chapter of the New Testament. Joshua, on the other hand, is from the line of Aaron, the priestly family. So between these two, the line of David and the line of Aaron, you have these 2 powerful and prominent leaders, one from the royal family, one from the priestly family. Together, as the leaders of those who are rebuilding the temple, they become the channels through which the Holy Spirit would flow. And the Holy Spirit would empower them for leadership to have the temple rebuilt as God had commissioned them. Slide 69. As we move to chapter 5, we have a vision of a flying scroll, which is written on both sides. Now, typically scrolls are only written on a single side because they're rolled up. This one, of course, is open, and it has inscriptions on both sides, and the fact that it is unrolled means that both sides can be read. This particular scroll is quite large. It is 20 cubits long and 10 cubits wide, which is approximately 30 feet by 15 feet. So this is certainly not a scroll you're going to put in your pocket. This is a very large scroll. And on one side, there is the curse against thievery, so that every thief in the land will be banished. On the other side, there is a curse against anyone who swears falsely, and they also will be banished from the land. And this scroll, God said, would be sent out so that it would enter the house of any thief or the house of any person who swore falsely by his name, and it would destroy that person and his household. In slide 69, you can see one example of an ancient scroll that is unrolled, this one from Cambridge University Library, called the Nash Papyrus, that contains the 10 words, or the 10 Commandments. I show this particularly because 2 of the 10 Commandments seem to figure prominently in the scroll that Zechariah sees in this vision. On the one side is a curse for violating the 3rd commandment, that is, for anyone who swears falsely. The 3rd commandment, which is given in Exodus 20 and also in Deuteronomy 5, is that you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Now, we'll come back to this in just a moment with a little bit more about how an Israelite might misuse the name of the Lord. On the other side, of course, is a curse for violating the 8th commandment, which is thou shalt not steal. By citing these 2 commandments, one early in the 10, the other late in the 10, it is clear that God expects the ancient laws of Israel to prevail. The people who are rebuilding this temple must be people who are concerned about being faithful to the covenant, faithful to the words of God that he has given in ancient times. And so while only 2 commandments are given, in a sense, they sort of represent the entire body of the Torah, so that the entire Torah, which is the covenant of God between God and Israel, is expected to be kept. God expected his ancient laws to prevail. Now, if you go to slide 70, I want to come back just for a moment to this idea of misusing Yahweh's name. The 3rd commandment prohibits the use of God's name in the sense that no one is to utter the name of God in a way that infringes upon God's power. Now, there were 2 primary ways of doing this, 2 primary abuses in oath-taking and in prophecy. The one, of course, that we're concerned with in Zechariah 5 is oath-taking. The standard oath for the ancient people of Israel was the preface to any statement by the words, as Yahweh lives. You will hear that on the lips of Elijah, for instance, as Yahweh lives, it will not rain until I say so. You hear it on the lips of Ruth, or at least an oath very similar to that. May Yahweh do to me whatever he pleases, and even more besides, if anything but death separates me and you, Ruth says to her mother-in-law Naomi. So oath-taking is a way of using the name of God to validate your personal statement. When you use the name Yahweh, it means that you are inviting the judgment of God if you have spoken falsely. Prophecy is somewhat similar in that prophets begin by saying, thus says Yahweh. And of course, as soon as they utter the name Yahweh, that means that what they are saying is supposed to be what Yahweh is saying. And for a prophet to use the expression, thus says Yahweh, when Yahweh has not spoken, is to misuse the name of the Lord. So in the flying scroll vision then, Zechariah is shown that the people of Israel must be very careful about keeping the law of Moses. They must not neglect the things that their ancestors neglected, because in fact it was precisely for the neglect of the laws of Moses and the covenant that God made at Sinai that their ancestors had been taken into exile in the first place. Now they have been privileged to come back from exile and to rebuild the temple and to rebuild Jerusalem, but they must be careful that they keep the law of God just the same. Slide 71. This little vision, which takes us to the end of chapter 5, probably reads rather strangely to people who read it for the first time. There is an angel that was speaking to Zechariah, and he says, do you see what's happening? He says, what is it? It's an ephah barrel or an ephah tub. The NIV translates this as a measuring basket, but the Hebrew text calls it an ephah basket or an ephah tub. It had a lead cover, and in some way this seems to symbolize the moral deterioration of the people in the land. For the angel says, this is the iniquity, or this is the appearance of the people throughout the land. When the cover of lead was raised and one could see into the basket, there sits a woman. Now, an ephah basket isn't that large. It's not large enough for a person to get inside, certainly. So the woman who's in the basket is a miniature, so to speak. She's a very small woman. And as the woman is viewed in the basket, the angel says, this is wickedness. And he pushed her back into the basket and pushed the lid back over the opening of the basket. Then Zechariah saw two women with wind in their wings, probably some sort of angel beings, and they lifted up the basket and they carried it all the way to the country of Babylon, where it says there was to be a house for it. And when it is ready, the basket will be set there in its place. Well, what in the world could such a vision mean? That the woman represents the power of evil is stated quite explicitly. The fact that she was to have a house in Babylon might mean that she is a goddess figure. For one thing, household shrines were common enough in the Persian period of little deities, gods or goddesses, and often they were associated with a little shrine like a miniature temple or a miniature house. So it's quite possible that this woman represents the goddess figure Ishtar, which was a patron deity in Babylon. Just as God had removed the remnant of Israelites from Babylon so that they could come back to Jerusalem and build God's house, now it was important to remove from the people anything that was left of Babylon. As the old saying goes, it's one thing to take the people out of Egypt, and it's another thing to take Egypt out of the people. Now the people have been taken from Babylon, but Babylon needs to be removed from the hearts of the people. And so the vestiges of Babylon are going to be removed from the land of Israel and sent back to Babylon, or in fact Shinar, as it says in the Hebrew text. The Hebrew text says Shinar, which connects it all the way back to the story in Genesis in which the people came to Shinar to build a tower into heaven. And there's probably a deliberate link between the name Shinar here in Zechariah chapter 5 all the way back to Genesis chapters 10 and 11, where they were going to build the tower into heaven, the Tower of Babel. And that, of course, also was an attempt to establish a false religion. So the ephah barrel with the woman in it is going to be taken back to Babylon. If you look at slide 72, you will notice an example of the little house shrine and the little miniature figures that were typical of household deities and household shrines. This one is actually from the Persian period, about the time we're talking about. It was discovered near Amman, Jordan, and you can see it has the little house and a little Persian decorations on the house, a little scroll effect. And then it has deity figures, which are female deity figures, which are set around it, which probably represent Ishtar or one of the other gods or goddesses from Babylon that were popular in the Persian period. So it's quite possible that the explanation of this passage is that the house that was to be built for this woman in the basket is a house like this. It's a little household shrine. And the people of Israel must remove from their midst all of these vestiges of paganism. For one thing, God had commanded very clearly that they were to worship the Lord their God with all their heart, all their soul, all their mind, all their strength, and particularly they were not to make any kind of images of God or other gods. And if any of the people who came back from Babylon to Jerusalem had brought with them these kinds of pagan implements, it was important that they be purged from the people of Israel so that they could be a pure people. Now, slide 73. At the beginning of chapter 6 now, we come to the end of the 8 night visions. This one parallels the first night vision, and you will immediately see several similarities. In the first night vision, there were 4 horsemen. In the 8th night vision, there are 4 chariots of but each of them having 4 horses. And you'll also notice that in chapter 6 and verse 8, there is the statement about rest in the land. And you'll notice again that in the first vision, there was also the idea of rest or peace in the land in chapter 1 and verse 11. The couriers there had gone through the whole world to find rest and peace in the world. So these 4 horsemen in the first vision parallel the 4 chariots in the last vision. And once again, they seem to be patterned after the Persian imperial couriers who traveled throughout the empire to bring communication between the heartland of the Persian government and its outlying regions. I think I mentioned in the last lecture about the royal road that went all the way from Ecbatana to the area of Western Asia Minor, almost to the coast of the Aegean Sea. And so the Persian stormtroopers or Persian couriers have been sweeping back and forth to carry communications to the government of Persia. In the same way, God's stormtroopers or God's couriers, which may be angelic figures, are sweeping throughout the world to bring him information, to bring him the intelligence that he needs as he rules the world as the king of everything. In this vision, then, Zechariah sees 4 chariots coming out between 2 mountains of bronze. The first chariot had 4 red horses, the second 4 black horses, the third 4 white horses, and the fourth 4 dappled horses. All of them very powerful horses. When the angel answered Zechariah's question, who are these? He says, these are the 4 spirits of heaven. Once again, you have the word 4 here, not so much as a mathematical number, but as a programmatic number. 4 spirits of heaven going out from standing in the presence of the Lord of the whole world. And the one with the black horses is going toward the north country, the one with the white horses toward the west, the one with the dappled horses toward the south, and presumably the one with red horses is going east, even though it doesn't say so, but that seems to be the option that is left. As these powerful horses went out, they're straining to go throughout the earth. And the voice says, go throughout the earth, and so they did. And then he called me and said, look, those going toward the north country have given my spirit rest in the land of the north. Now, the meaning of this seems to be that since God's couriers have swept through the world and secured peace, the Babylonian-Persian wars are over now. There is not a threat from the outside to the people in Jerusalem and Judah, that this peace enables the exiles to return to Judah and to rebuild their temple. Once, many years earlier, they had been exiled to Babylon. Now they've been allowed to return in a time of relative peace. And if God had ordered history in such a way to permit the rebuilding of his temple in Jerusalem, if he had made world circumstances align themselves in such a way that the people of Judah could come back to Jerusalem to do this task, then the returned exiles should return to this work with energy, with enthusiasm, with all of their hearts. God had made it possible for them to complete this temple, and he had inspired Zerubbabel and Joshua, their leaders, to lead them in this work. And so now the people need to support their leaders with all of their hearts. This seems to be the meaning of this final vision. The last 2 slides in this series, 74 and 75, are basically depictions of Persian chariotry. This will give you a visual idea of what the chariots may have looked like that Zechariah saw. This first slide, slide 74, is a very small gold model of a Persian chariot that comes from about the time of Zechariah, about the 5th or 4th century BC. It was discovered in Afghanistan. It is Persian in origin. It is currently in the British Museum in London, England, on the 2nd floor, in amongst the displays of various other Persian artifacts. Not very large, actually. It's quite a small model. It would sit easily on a coffee table, for instance. And you can see, of course, that it has 4 horses, just like those that are described in the vision of Zechariah. It has a couple of people riding in the chariot, a 2-wheeled chariot, so you get some kind of visual idea of what it may have looked like. Slide 75, also from the British Museum, is a fragment, but it also shows someone standing in a chariot, and this one also excavated from Persepolis in Persia about the 5th century BC. So it also goes back to about the time of Zechariah, and it shows a Persian officer in a chariot holding onto the reins of his horses. So, to summarize then, in Zechariah's 8 night visions, while these are probably a bit strange to our way of thinking, and as we read these passages, we say, wow, these are incredibly bizarre kinds of visions that Zechariah had, yet they were deeply meaningful to the people who were building the second temple. They encouraged them that this was a work of God, that God was passionate about this temple being rebuilt. And in fact, God's messianic future was linked to the building of this temple. The two primary leaders, Zerubbabel and Joshua, represented the royal line of David and the priestly line of Aaron, which were so central for the people of Israel. All implements of paganism must be removed, but God had established world circumstances in such a way that they could continue this work. And so just as it says in the book of Ezra, under the preaching of Haggai and Zechariah, the people prospered and they began this work on the temple, and they would in fact complete it just as the book of Zechariah said. Zerubbabel would be the one to lay the capstone on that second temple, and the people would indeed shout for joy. This ends Lecture 8.